The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at Chicago O'Hare International Airport as 72-year-old Marcus Washington made his way through the bustling terminal. His weathered hands gripped a simple black leather briefcase, the only hint of his extraordinary wealth being the subtle gleam of a vintage Patek Philippe watch on his wrist. Marcus had learned long ago that true power often dressed in humble clothes. Born in rural Mississippi during the height of segregation, Marcus had clawed his way from cotton fields to corporate boardrooms through sheer determination and an almost supernatural ability to spot opportunities others missed. His empire now spanned technology, real estate, and renewable energy, making him one of the wealthiest black men in America. Yet despite his billions, he still preferred flying commercial, believing it kept him connected to the real world that many of his peers had forgotten. Today's flight to Los Angeles was particularly important. Marcus was scheduled to meet with city officials about a massive urban renewal project that could transform entire neighborhoods while creating thousands of jobs. The project represented more than just another business venture. It was his chance to give back to communities that looked like the one he'd grown up in, communities that had been overlooked for far too long. As he approached Gate B-17, Marcus noticed the usual pre-boarding chaos. Families juggled luggage while business travelers typed frantically on their phones. He found a quiet corner and settled into a worn plastic chair, pulling out a dog-eared copy of a biography about Frederick Douglass. Reading had always been his escape, his way of learning from those who had paved the path before him. The gate agent's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the boarding process for Flight 447 to Los Angeles. Marcus waited patiently as first-class passengers were called, then premium members, then frequent flyers. When his boarding group was finally announced, he gathered his belongings and joined the line, his mind already focused on the important meetings ahead. But as he handed his boarding pass to the gate agent, something shifted in the young woman's demeanor. Her professional smile faltered as she examined his ticket, then looked him up and down with barely concealed disdain. She called over her supervisor, a stern-faced man in his 40s who approached with the swagger of someone drunk on minor authority. The supervisor studied Marcus's boarding pass with exaggerated scrutiny, as if searching for evidence of forgery. Other passengers began to notice the holdup, craning their necks to see what was causing the delay. Marcus felt the familiar weight of unwanted attention, the same feeling he'd experienced countless times throughout his life when his presence in certain spaces was questioned. The supervisor whispered something to the gate agent, who nodded and began typing furiously on her computer. Marcus waited, maintaining his dignity despite the growing murmur of impatient passengers behind him. He'd learned long ago that reacting with anger would only confirm their suspicions and give them the excuse they were looking for. After what felt like an eternity, the supervisor looked up with cold eyes and delivered his verdict with the confidence of a judge pronouncing sentence. There had been an upgrade irregularity with Marcus's seat, he claimed. Despite holding a valid first-class ticket that he had purchased months in advance, they would need to move him to coach to accommodate a more suitable passenger. The words hung in the air like a slap. Marcus understood immediately what was happening. This wasn't about seat upgrades or computer glitches. This was about a successful black man being put in what they considered his proper place. The supervisor's tone made it clear that this wasn't a request, but an ultimatum. Other passengers began to fidget uncomfortably, some looking down at their phones to avoid witnessing the humiliation unfolding before them. A few seemed to nod in approval, as if justice was finally being served. Marcus felt the weight of history pressing down on him, remembering stories his grandmother had told him about the indignities of Jim Crow, about being forced to give up seats and accept lesser treatment simply because of the color of their skin. But this was 2024, not 1954. This was supposed to be a different world, one where a man's character and achievements mattered more than the melanin in his skin. As Marcus looked around at the sea of faces, some sympathetic, some hostile, most simply indifferent, he realized that perhaps the world hadn't changed as much as he'd hoped. The supervisor grew impatient with Marcus's silence, interpreting it as defiance rather than the careful consideration it actually was. He gestured toward a security guard stationed nearby, a clear threat that compliance wasn't optional. The guard began moving in their direction, his hand resting casually on his radio. Marcus felt something crystallize inside him, a moment of perfect clarity that would change everything that followed. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every person who had ever been diminished, dismissed, or degraded because of their race. This was about the young black executives who would board planes in the future, wondering if their success would be enough to shield them from the same treatment. He looked directly into the supervisor's eyes and spoke in a voice that carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard in boardrooms and government offices. He would not be moved to coach. He had purchased his seat legally, and he intended to occupy it. If they had a problem with that, they could find another solution. The supervisor's face reddened, clearly unaccustomed to having his authority challenged, especially by someone he considered beneath him. He made a show of checking his watch and looking at the long line of passengers still waiting to board. Time was money in the airline business, and delays cost everyone. With theatrical frustration, he announced loudly that if Marcus wouldn't accept their generous offer to relocate him, they would have no choice but to remove him from the flight entirely. The words echoed through the gate area, drawing stares and whispered conversations from other travelers. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding that this moment would define not just his day, but potentially the trajectory of an entire industry. As security approached and other passengers looked on, he made a decision that would cost one airline everything and change the way business was done forever. The security guards approached Marcus with the mechanical efficiency of men who had done this countless times before. Their faces showed no emotion as they flanked him on either side, their presence designed to intimidate and humiliate. Other passengers pulled out their phones, some recording the scene while others simply gawked at the spectacle unfolding before them. Marcus remained perfectly still, his dignity intact even as the situation escalated around him. He had faced down hostile corporate boards, navigated treacherous political negotiations, and weathered economic storms that had destroyed lesser men. 2 airport security guards didn't frighten him, but the symbolism of what was happening cut deep. As they escorted him away from the gate, Marcus heard the murmur of conversations behind him. Some passengers expressed outrage at what they were witnessing, while others muttered about entitled troublemakers holding up their flights. The divide in reactions told him everything he needed to know about how far society still had to go. The airport's security office was a sterile, windowless room that smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee. Marcus was processed like a common criminal, his personal belongings searched and documented while officers filled out incident reports. The irony wasn't lost on him that a man who employed thousands of people and had never so much as received a speeding ticket was being treated like a threat to public safety. During the 2 hours he spent in that room, Marcus's mind wasn't on his missed meetings or the inconvenience to his schedule. Instead, he was calculating. His business empire had been built on his ability to see patterns others missed, to identify weaknesses in systems and exploit them for maximum advantage. As he sat in that uncomfortable plastic chair, he began to see Atlantic Airways not as an unstoppable corporate giant, but as a vulnerable entity with fatal flaws in its operations. The airline industry had always fascinated Marcus from a business perspective. It was an industry built on thin profit margins, customer loyalty programs, and government regulations that could make or break a company overnight. Most importantly, it was an industry that depended heavily on public perception and corporate reputation. One major scandal could wipe out years of careful brand building and cost millions in lost revenue. When Marcus was finally released, he didn't immediately call his lawyers or demand to speak to anyone's supervisor. Instead, he walked calmly to the nearest car rental counter and secured a vehicle for the drive to Los Angeles. The 12-hour journey would give him time to think, to plan, and to make some very important phone calls. As his rented Mercedes glided through the Illinois countryside, Marcus began reaching out to his network. His first call was to Janet Chen, his chief financial officer and one of the sharpest minds in corporate strategy. Janet had been with him for 15 years, helping him navigate everything from hostile takeovers to regulatory challenges. When he explained what had happened, Janet's reaction was immediate and fierce. She had witnessed discrimination throughout her own career as an Asian American woman in finance, and the injustice of Marcus's treatment struck a personal chord. But beyond her emotional response, Janet's business mind immediately began calculating the possibilities. Atlantic Airways was publicly traded, which meant their financial information was readily available. The company had been struggling with increased competition from budget carriers and rising fuel costs. Their stock price had been declining steadily over the past 2 years, and recent customer satisfaction surveys showed growing dissatisfaction with their service quality. Marcus's second call was to David Rodriguez, his head of legal affairs and a former federal prosecutor who had never lost a civil rights case. David's expertise in discrimination law would be crucial for the legal strategy they were beginning to formulate. But Marcus made it clear that lawsuits would be only one part of a much larger plan. The third call went to Sarah Johnson, his director of public relations and a former investigative journalist, who understood how to shape public narratives. Sarah had helped Marcus weather previous controversies and knew how to use media attention as a strategic weapon. Her connections with major news outlets and social media influencers would prove invaluable in the coming weeks. By the time Marcus reached Los Angeles, his team was already in motion. Janet was analyzing Atlantic Airways' financial vulnerabilities, looking for leverage points they could exploit. David was researching similar cases and building a legal framework that would maximize both financial damages and public attention. Sarah was crafting a media strategy that would turn Marcus's humiliation into Atlantic Airways' nightmare. But Marcus had something bigger in mind than just revenge or financial compensation. As he sat in his Los Angeles hotel suite that night, looking out at the city lights, he began to envision something unprecedented in corporate history. He wasn't just going to sue Atlantic Airways or launch a public relations campaign against them. He was going to systematically dismantle their business model and replace it with something better. The plan that began forming in Marcus's mind was audacious in its scope and brilliant in its simplicity. He would use his vast resources to create a competing airline that would not just challenge Atlantic Airways, but demonstrate how aviation could be done better, more fairly, and more profitably. Every humiliation he had suffered would become a lesson in how to treat customers with dignity and respect. Marcus spent the next 3 days in Los Angeles, conducting his originally scheduled meetings while his team worked around the clock back in Chicago. The urban renewal project was approved unanimously, but his mind was already focused on his next venture. The city officials he met with were impressed by his composure and professionalism, having no idea of the storm that was brewing behind his calm exterior. When Marcus finally flew back to Chicago later that week, he deliberately chose a different airline for his return trip. The contrast in service quality was stark and immediate. The staff treated him with genuine respect. His boarding process was smooth and efficient, and the overall experience reminded him of what air travel could be when done properly. As his plane descended toward O'Hare, Marcus looked down at the airport where his ordeal had begun just days earlier. Atlantic Airways planes dotted the tarmac below, their corporate logo gleaming in the afternoon sun. The sight filled him not with anger, but with quiet determination. Atlantic Airways had made the mistake of underestimating him, of seeing only his age and his race rather than recognizing the formidable businessman beneath. They had treated him as disposable, forgettable, someone who would simply accept their mistreatment and move on with his life. They were about to learn just how wrong they had been. Marcus Washington had built an empire by turning obstacles into opportunities, and Atlantic Airways had just handed him the biggest opportunity of his career. The airline industry was about to experience a revolution, and it would all begin with one elderly black man who refused to accept that his place was anywhere other than exactly where he belonged. The conference room on the 50th floor of the Washington Tower hummed with nervous energy as Marcus's executive team gathered for what they already sensed would be a historic meeting. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a spectacular view of Chicago's skyline, but all eyes were focused on the man who had built this empire from nothing. Marcus entered precisely at 9 o'clock, his movements deliberate and purposeful. He had spent the weekend refining his strategy, and the fire in his eyes told everyone present that something momentous was about to unfold. The incident at O'Hare had lit a fuse that was about to ignite the most ambitious business venture of his already legendary career. Janet Chen was the first to speak, her laptop already open to financial projections that would make most CEOs dizzy. She had spent 72 hours straight analyzing Atlantic Airways from every conceivable angle, and what she had discovered was more promising than any of them had dared hope. The airline wasn't just vulnerable, it was practically begging to be conquered by a smarter, better-funded competitor. Atlantic Airways carried a crushing debt load of nearly $8 billion, much of it in high-interest loans that would come due within the next 5 years. Their aging fleet required massive maintenance investments they couldn't afford, leading to frequent delays and cancellations that infuriated customers. Most damaging of all, their customer satisfaction ratings had plummeted to industry lows, creating a reputation crisis that was bleeding passengers to competitors. David Rodriguez followed with his legal analysis, and his findings were equally encouraging. The discrimination case against Atlantic Airways was ironclad, with multiple witnesses and clear documentation of the racial profiling Marcus had endured. But more importantly, David had uncovered a pattern of similar incidents that suggested this wasn't an isolated event, but a systemic problem within the company's culture. Sarah Johnson's media research revealed that Atlantic Airways was already fighting public relations battles on multiple fronts. Recent incidents involving poor customer service, questionable safety practices, and employee disputes had created a perfect storm of negative publicity. One more major scandal could push them past the point of no return. But Marcus wasn't interested in simply destroying Atlantic Airways. He wanted to replace them with something better, something that would revolutionize how airlines treated their customers and operated their businesses. His vision was breathtaking in its scope. A new kind of airline that would combine luxury service with affordable pricing, environmental responsibility with operational efficiency. The new airline would be called Horizon Airways, and it would embody everything that Atlantic Airways was not. Every aspect of the customer experience would be designed with dignity and respect as core principles. There would be no arbitrary seat changes, no discriminatory treatment, no nickeling and diming of passengers for basic services. Marcus outlined his staffing philosophy with the passion of a man who had experienced workplace discrimination firsthand. Horizon Airways would actively recruit from communities that had been historically underrepresented in the aviation industry. Training programs would emphasize not just technical skills, but cultural sensitivity and customer service excellence. The fleet would consist entirely of new, fuel-efficient aircraft equipped with the latest technology. Every seat would offer generous legroom, complimentary Wi-Fi, and entertainment systems loaded with diverse content. The food service would feature menus developed by renowned chefs, with options reflecting the cultural diversity of American cuisine. But perhaps most revolutionary was Marcus's approach to pricing. Instead of the confusing maze of fees and restrictions that plagued the industry, Horizon Airways would offer transparent, all-inclusive pricing. Passengers would know exactly what they were paying for, with no hidden costs or surprise charges. This environmental impact was another key differentiator. Horizon Airways would offset 100% of its carbon emissions through investments in renewable energy and reforestation projects. The airline would also partner with sustainable fuel producers to reduce its environmental footprint even further. Janet's financial models showed that the plan was not only feasible, but potentially incredibly profitable. The startup costs would be substantial, nearly $2 billion for the first phase alone. But Marcus's diverse business empire could easily absorb that investment. More importantly, the projected returns were staggering, with break-even expected within 3 years and massive profits thereafter. The team spent hours refining the strategy, identifying potential challenges and developing solutions. The regulatory hurdles would be significant, requiring approvals from multiple government agencies. The logistics of launching a new airline were mind-bogglingly complex, involving everything from pilot recruitment to ground handling contracts. But Marcus had faced seemingly impossible challenges before. When he started his technology company in the 1980s, Experts said a black man from Mississippi could never compete with Silicon Valley giants. When he entered the renewable energy sector, critics claimed he lacked the technical expertise to succeed. Each time he had proven them wrong through careful planning, relentless execution, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. As the meeting progressed, the excitement in the room became palpable. This wasn't just another business venture. It was a chance to right historical wrongs while building something magnificent. Every person in that room understood they were participating in something that would be studied in business schools for generations to come. Marcus assigned specific roles to each team member, creating a structure that would allow them to move quickly while maintaining quality control. Janet would lead the financial planning and fundraising efforts. David would navigate the regulatory requirements and handle legal challenges. Sarah would manage public relations and marketing strategy. The timeline was aggressive but achievable. Within 6 months, they would have all necessary approvals and financing in place. The first routes would launch within 18 months, focusing initially on high-traffic corridors where Atlantic Airways was most vulnerable. By year 3, Horizon Airways would be operating coast to coast with international expansion on the horizon. But before any of that could happen, they needed to send Atlantic Airways a message they would never forget. The discrimination lawsuit would be filed publicly, with maximum media attention. The goal wasn't just financial compensation, but forcing a national conversation about racial bias in corporate America. Marcus stood and walked to the windows, looking out at the city where he had built his fortune. Somewhere out there, Atlantic Airways executives were going about their daily routines, completely unaware that their world was about to change forever. They had humiliated him, believing he was powerless to fight back. They were about to discover just how wrong they had been. Within hours, the first phase of Marcus's plan would begin. Atlantic Airways had awakened a sleeping giant, and now they would face the consequences of their actions. The meeting concluded with everyone understanding their roles and the magnitude of what they were attempting. As the team filed out of the conference room, Marcus remained at the window, his reflection showing a man transformed by purpose. The scared young boy from Mississippi was gone, replaced by a warrior ready to change an entire industry. The revolution was about to begin, and Marcus Washington would lead it personally. The courthouse steps were packed with reporters and camera crews as David Rodriguez emerged from the federal building, a thick legal document clutched in his experienced hands. The discrimination lawsuit against Atlantic Airways had been officially filed, and the media response was immediate and overwhelming. News vans lined the street while journalists shouted questions, and photographers captured every moment of what was already being called the civil rights case of the decade. Inside the courthouse, the filing had caused a sensation among court clerks and legal staff who rarely saw cases with such explosive potential. The lawsuit didn't just seek financial damages. It demanded sweeping changes to Atlantic Airways' policies, procedures, and corporate culture. The legal document read like a roadmap for transforming how airlines treated customers, particularly those from minority communities. Marcus had deliberately chosen not to attend the filing, understanding that his presence would only fuel more speculation about his motives. Instead, he was 300 miles away in Detroit, meeting with aviation industry veterans who would become the backbone of his new airline. These were seasoned professionals who had grown disgusted with how major carriers treated both employees and customers. Captain Maria Santos was the first to join Horizon Airways, bringing 30 years of commercial aviation experience and a stellar safety record that spoke for itself. As a Latina pilot who had faced her own share of discrimination, she understood Marcus's vision on a personal level. Her decision to leave Atlantic Airways sent shockwaves through the industry, as other pilots began questioning their own loyalty to companies that didn't value their contributions. The recruitment process was unlike anything the aviation industry had ever seen. Instead of simply poaching talent from competitors, Marcus was building something entirely new from the ground up. Flight attendants were hired not just for their service skills, but for their ability to create inclusive, welcoming environments for passengers from all backgrounds. Meanwhile, Janet Chen was orchestrating the financial aspects of the venture, with the precision of a master conductor. The initial funding came from Marcus's personal fortune, but she was also securing commitments from institutional investors who saw the opportunity to be part of something revolutionary. Environmental investment funds were particularly interested in Horizon Airways' sustainability commitments. The aircraft procurement process was moving faster than anyone in the industry thought possible. Marcus had leveraged his relationships with manufacturers to secure delivery slots that other airlines had been waiting years to obtain. The planes would be configured with more space per passenger than any major carrier, with every detail designed to enhance the travel experience. Atlantic Airways' initial response to the lawsuit was predictably dismissive. Their corporate communications team issued a bland statement expressing confidence in their policies and procedures, while promising to defend against what they characterized as baseless allegations. Behind closed doors, however, panic was beginning to set in as executives realized the full scope of what they were facing. The first crack in Atlantic Airways' facade appeared when a former employee came forward with internal documents showing that the incident involving Marcus was not isolated. Email chains revealed discussions among management about problem passengers that used thinly veiled racial language. Training materials contained guidance that essentially profiled customers based on appearance and demeanor in ways that clearly violated federal discrimination laws. Sarah Johnson had orchestrated the media strategy with surgical precision, ensuring that every revelation received maximum exposure while maintaining Marcus's dignity and credibility. She scheduled interviews with respected journalists who understood the broader implications of the story, avoiding sensationalistic coverage that might trivialize the serious issues at stake. The story resonated far beyond the aviation industry. Civil rights organizations rallied to support Marcus's cause, while business leaders from various sectors began sharing their own experiences with discrimination. The hashtag Justice at 30,000 feet began trending on social media, with thousands of passengers sharing their own stories of mistreatment by airlines. Atlantic Airways' stock price began a slow but steady decline as investors grew nervous about the potential financial impact of the lawsuit. Industry analysts started questioning the company's long-term viability, particularly given their existing financial challenges. The discrimination scandal was the last thing they needed while trying to restructure their massive debt load. But the most devastating blow came when 3 more passengers came forward with similar stories of discrimination by Atlantic Airways staff. Each incident followed a pattern of racial profiling and humiliating treatment that suggested systemic problems within the company's culture. The lawsuits began multiplying, creating a legal tsunami that threatened to overwhelm the airline's resources. Marcus watched these developments from his temporary headquarters in a converted warehouse near O'Hare Airport, where his team was working around the clock to launch Horizon Airways. The space buzzed with activity as engineers, designers, marketers, and operations specialists collaborated on creating something the aviation industry had never seen before. The customer service protocols being developed at Horizon Airways were revolutionary in their emphasis on dignity and respect. Every interaction was designed to make passengers feel valued and appreciated, regardless of their background or appearance. Training programs included extensive modules on unconscious bias, cultural sensitivity, and conflict resolution. Technology played a crucial role in the new airline's approach to customer service. Advanced analytics would help predict and prevent potential problems before they impacted passengers. Mobile apps would provide real-time updates and personalized service options. Artificial intelligence would assist staff in providing better, more efficient service while maintaining the human touch that made travel special. The pricing transparency that Marcus had insisted upon was proving to be one of Horizon Airways' most popular features among potential customers. Focus groups consistently praised the all-inclusive approach that eliminated surprise fees and hidden charges. The airline industry's reputation for nickel-and-diming customers was so poor that simple honesty in pricing became a major competitive advantage. Environmental groups were taking notice of Horizon Airways' sustainability commitments, which went far beyond the token gestures offered by established carriers. The airline would plant trees to offset more carbon than it produced, invest in renewable energy projects, and work with suppliers who shared their environmental values. As the weeks passed, more industry professionals began jumping ship to join Horizon Airways. Baggage handlers tired of working for companies that treated them poorly found better opportunities. Gate agents frustrated with policies that forced them to mistreat customers discovered an employer that empowered them to provide excellent service. Atlantic Airways found themselves hemorrhaging talent at every level, from pilots to mechanics to customer service representatives. Exit interviews revealed a common theme. Employees were tired of working for a company that didn't align with their values. They wanted to be part of something better, something that made them proud to come to work every day. The regulatory approval process for Horizon Airways was moving smoothly, helped by Marcus's reputation for ethical business practices and his team's meticulous attention to detail. Federal aviation officials were impressed by the comprehensive safety protocols and innovative operational procedures that would set new industry standards. Meanwhile, Atlantic Airways was facing increased scrutiny from those same regulators as the discrimination scandal continued to unfold. Surprise inspections were finding maintenance issues and procedural violations that raised serious questions about the airline's overall management competence. Marcus knew that the hardest challenges still lay ahead, but he could feel the momentum building toward something extraordinary. Every setback that Atlantic Airways experienced, every talented employee who joined Horizon Airways, every passenger who shared their story of mistreatment brought him closer to his ultimate goal. The transformation of an entire industry was beginning, and Marcus Washington was leading the charge. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity as the discrimination lawsuit against Atlantic Airways reached its dramatic climax. Judge Patricia Williams, a distinguished African-American jurist with a reputation for fairness and thorough legal analysis, presided over proceedings that had captivated the nation for months. The case had evolved far beyond a simple discrimination claim into a sweeping indictment of systemic bias in corporate America. Atlantic Airways' legal team had tried every possible defense, from claiming the incident was a misunderstanding to arguing that Marcus had been treated the same as any other difficult passenger. But the evidence was overwhelming, and their arguments fell apart under David Rodriguez's methodical cross-examination of airline employees who had clearly been trained to lie under oath. The most damaging testimony came from former Atlantic Airways supervisor James Mitchell, who had been present during Marcus's removal from the flight. Under intense questioning, Mitchell broke down and admitted that the airline had unofficial policies for dealing with passengers they deemed problematic, which almost always meant people of color who dared to assert their rights. As Mitchell spoke, the courtroom fell silent except for the scratching of reporters' pens and the quiet sobs of spectators who recognized their own experiences in his words. He described training sessions where employees were taught to use coded language to justify discriminatory treatment, creating a veneer of legitimacy over what everyone understood to be racial profiling. The financial evidence presented by Janet Chen was equally devastating. Her forensic accountants had discovered that Atlantic Airways had been systematically overbooking flights and then removing passengers based on discriminatory criteria. The practice had generated millions in additional revenue, while causing immeasurable harm to the victims of their bias. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Marcus himself took the witness stand. His quiet dignity and measured responses stood in stark contrast to the airline's aggressive defense tactics. When asked why he hadn't simply accepted the airline's offer to move him to coach, Marcus looked directly at the jury and explained that some principles were more important than convenience. He spoke about his grandmother, who had lived through Jim Crow and taught him that dignity was something no one could take away unless you let them. He described the humiliation of being treated like a criminal for simply existing while black in a first-class seat. Most importantly, he explained how that moment had crystallized his determination to create something better for future generations. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with a verdict that sent shockwaves through the airline industry. They awarded Marcus $25 million in compensatory damages, finding that Atlantic Airways had engaged in intentional discrimination. But the real bombshell was the additional $100 million in punitive damages, designed to send a message that such behavior would not be tolerated. Even more significant than the financial award were the structural changes the court ordered. Atlantic Airways would be required to implement comprehensive bias training for all employees, establish an independent oversight board to monitor discrimination complaints, and submit to regular audits of their passenger treatment policies. The verdict made headlines around the world, but Marcus was already focused on the next phase of his plan. While Atlantic Airways reeled from the legal defeat and accompanying publicity nightmare, Horizon Airways was preparing for its inaugural flight. The timing wasn't coincidental. Marcus had orchestrated events to maximize the contrast between the old way of doing business and the new standard he was setting. The launch event for Horizon Airways was unlike anything the aviation industry had ever seen. Instead of the typical corporate celebration filled with executives and dignitaries, Marcus threw open the doors to the entire community. Families from the neighborhoods where he'd grown up were invited to tour the gleaming new aircraft and meet the diverse crew members who would serve passengers with unprecedented respect and professionalism. Captain Maria Santos stood proudly at the cockpit door, greeting guests with a warmth that was completely authentic. Her path to becoming Horizon Airways' chief pilot had been filled with obstacles, but Marcus had recognized her talent and given her the opportunity to lead by example. Behind her stood a crew that represented the beautiful diversity of America. Each member carefully selected not just for their skills but for their commitment to treating every passenger with dignity. The aircraft itself was a marvel of thoughtful design. Every detail had been considered with the passenger experience in mind, from the extra-wide seats to the noise-dampening technology that created a peaceful environment at 30,000 feet. The cabin featured artwork from local artists creating a uniquely American aesthetic that celebrated the country's cultural richness. But the most revolutionary aspect of Horizon Airways wasn't visible to passengers at all. It was the company culture that Marcus had carefully cultivated, where every employee understood that their primary mission was to make travel a positive experience for everyone. Training programs emphasized empathy, cultural competence, and problem-solving skills that would prevent the kind of incidents that had made other airlines infamous. The inaugural flight from Chicago to Los Angeles was booked solid within minutes of tickets going on sale. Passengers included civil rights leaders, business executives, celebrities, and ordinary Americans who wanted to be part of history. The waiting list stretched into the thousands, creating a buzz of anticipation that money couldn't buy. Marcus chose to take that first flight, occupying the same seat that he would have had on Atlantic Airways if they hadn't removed him. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone, and photographers captured the moment when he settled into his seat with a quiet smile of satisfaction. This was more than revenge. It was justice served with impeccable style. The service during that inaugural flight set new standards for the industry. Flight attendants remembered passengers' names, dietary preferences were accommodated without question, and every interaction was infused with genuine care and respect. Children received special attention that made them feel important rather than inconvenient. Elderly passengers were assisted with dignity rather than impatience. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Marcus walked through the cabin, personally, thanking passengers for choosing Horizon Airways and listening to their thoughts about the experience. Many shared their own stories of mistreatment by other airlines, expressing gratitude that someone had finally created an alternative that aligned with their values. The media coverage of the inaugural flight was overwhelmingly positive, with reporters noting the stark contrast between Horizon Airways' respectful treatment of passengers and the industry standard of barely concealed hostility. Aviation bloggers began predicting that other airlines would be forced to improve their service standards or face extinction. Atlantic Airways' response was a masterclass in corporate tone deafness. Their executives dismissed Horizon Airways as a publicity stunt that would fail once the novelty wore off. They claimed that their own service standards were perfectly adequate, and that customers who wanted special treatment would have to pay premium prices for it. But the market response told a different story. Horizon Airways' customer satisfaction scores were breaking industry records, while Atlantic Airways continued to sink in every meaningful metric. Passengers were willing to pay slightly higher fares for significantly better treatment, proving that Marcus's business model was not only morally superior, but financially sound. The success of Horizon Airways was attracting attention from investors around the world who wanted to be associated with the next generation of corporate leadership. Marcus was already planning expansion routes that would bring his vision of respectful air travel to more cities across the country. As the inaugural flight touched down in Los Angeles to thunderous applause from passengers and ground crew alike, Marcus knew that he had accomplished something far greater than personal vindication. He had proven that businesses could be both profitable and principled, that success didn't require compromising your values or mistreating others. The revolution in air travel had officially begun, and there was no turning back. 2 years after that fateful day at O'Hare Airport, the aviation industry had been completely transformed. Horizon Airways had expanded to serve 47 cities across North America, with international routes launching monthly to destinations that passengers had specifically requested. Every flight maintained the same standard of respectful service that